Well, thanks so much, Robin. And those are interesting words you chose, Robin. A challenge. I'm pretty sure I always understood challenge as two equals facing off to see who's a little bit better. Hot dogs and marshmallows, I don't know if I'd put that in the same category, but you just look tonight and count how many marshmallows you see, and you tell me if you think that's a fair challenge or if you're outnumbered. But anyways, glad you're here, whether online or in the room. And I want to tell you a story. Last year, I think it was a year ago, I was at the gym, and I was in the change room, doing what you do in the change room, changing, and there's a gentleman, an elderly gentleman, and just to be fair, okay, if I say elderly, I'm just saying they're elder than me. Okay, so you're 41, you're elderly in my books because you're older than me, okay? So don't be offended if I use the term elderly, I'm just lumping you all in one category, okay? Some of you who are maybe on the further end of that spectrum, hey, you just got lumped in with 35-year-olds, that's great, okay? So anyways, elderly gentleman to my left at his locker strikes up a conversation, how you doing today? And I was like, oh, good, right? Just doing my, thing. It's what you do in change rooms, okay? Don't judge me. So anyways, I'm just changing and strikes up a conversation. How's your weekend? And where do you live? And where in Guelph? Oh, I'm new to Guelph, actually, from Toronto originally. And he's like, what brings you to Guelph? And I'm like, all right, there it is, 30 seconds. Now you're about to find out I'm a pastor, and then this could go one of two ways, right? Always makes for interesting conversation. So anyways, I'm like, came for a job. Well, where do you work? I work at a place called Lakeside. It's a church, and I'm the pastor there. He's like, I know Lakeside. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, he's like, yeah, actually, my kids and grandkids go there. I go to this other church, but in fact, I was at Lakeside this past weekend. And I'm just like, oh, cool. And I'm like, I don't know what his review is going to be. I don't know where it's going to go. He's like, yeah, that guy, Mark was preaching, and he was terrible. No, I'm kidding. That's not what he said. Up to the part where Mark was preaching. And then I was like, I don't know what he's going to say. But anyways, and so I didn't want to wait for his review of Mark. So I just thought, as we're just kind of, changing and all that, I was just like, hey, that's actually me. I'm Mark. And so now I'm at the point I'm in my underwear. And this is legitimately what happens, okay? This is how the conversation goes. I'm like, actually, I'm Mark. And he's like, oh, you look different. Like, yeah, I hide all that muscle really well under my preaching shirt, clearly. But anyways, that was the beginning of our first conversation, which then turned out to be many conversations, and I got to know him. We actually came to the gym every day at the same time, and so we'd always chat, and I learned about his life and his travels. He had spent a lot of time in different countries around the world telling people about Jesus. Many of you call that missions work. And now he was retired, and so I would ask him, so what's your day like today? Do you sip margaritas all day? What's retirement like? And he would just kind of lay out his day for me, and I just listened to all the things he was doing. I'm like, you're busier than me, and I have a job. He's just kind of explaining. He's like, yeah, and then I volunteer with international students. I just think it's a great way to show hospitality and love and care for them, and I love to tell them about Jesus, but I just volunteer teaching them the English language, and it's a great time, and then I do this, and then I do that. I just thought, that's a very different retirement than a lot of people have in their sights. And yet, as I chatted with him, you could see that he was alive. And he was excited. And today, we're talking about that theme. We're talking about retirement, and maybe the only time in Scripture when the theme of retirement comes up. Now, some of you are thinking, I'm 18, this has nothing to do with me. Don't worry, I promise you, it applies to you today. And others of you are thinking, listen, I'm 2 weeks away from retirement. Don't you dare mess with my plans, Mark. And listen, I promise, I'm not gonna mess with your plans. Jesus might, but I won't. That's where we're going today. And so if you want to turn in your Bible to Luke chapter 12, verse 13, I would love for you to join along with us. We are near the end of a series called Clash of Kings. We've been in it all summer, and the whole premise of the series is simply this. I want to do what I want, when I want, how I want, with whomever I want, for however long as I want, and I don't want anyone to tell me otherwise. And Jesus comes, and he says that he's king, and he wants to be Lord of our lives. And often, there's a clash. Because often we're like, I love Jesus, I love all the amazing things he did. And people were always with Jesus, but at some point, Jesus always clashed with them in one way. Sometimes it was with the religious elite who were power mongers. Sometimes it was with people who had already settled into their life and he was inviting them to something else. At some point, all people clashed with the king. At some point, all people clashed with Jesus. And this summer, as Jesus followers, we just kind of said, we're gonna welcome the clash. We're gonna step into the uncomfortable conversation and we're gonna move into it. And others of you, you kind of been joining with us, you've been joining us online or now in the room, and you're kind of like, I'm not sure what I believe, I'm intrigued by Jesus, but I'm just gonna stay open. I'm gonna like audit the course. And so many of you have been on that journey, just kind of exploring Jesus, getting to know Jesus, getting to know some of the things that maybe you didn't know before. I've had tons of conversations. People are like, I had no idea Jesus did that, said that, that's amazing. It's just kind of this like drawing close. You need to know that's not abnormal. In fact, 2,000 years ago, you look at history, people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. People who were nothing like Jesus, you read the stories of Jesus' life, and it's people who were nothing like him were constantly drawing close, creeping closer, asking questions like, what about, hey, or snuck out in the middle of the night, hey, can I talk to you for a minute? I don't want my friends to know, but I have some questions because there's something about you that is irresistible. Jesus was irresistible to people. And so many of you have been on that journey. Maybe you're here for the first time. And so welcome, welcome, welcome as we jump into it. Hopefully by now you've found Luke chapter 12, verse 13. Okay, here we go. So set the story up. Jesus is talking to thousands of people. There's thousands and thousands of people all around him. This was not uncommon. In fact, there are times where the crowd gets so big, Jesus has to get into a boat at the beach and push off a little bit so he doesn't get crushed, so he can teach the people. So it's not uncommon, thousands of people there. And then the story begins. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And then Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Jesus is like, whoa. Who made me the relational referee? Why are you asking me to do this? This isn't my job. Who made me judge or arbiter between you? But then Jesus goes further and he adds something else to the conversation. He said this, "Watch out." It's almost like he's talking to the guy. He's like, "Hey, I'm not your referee. I'm not gonna get involved in this." And then it's like he addresses the crowd and he's like, "Hey, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed." That's an important word for today, all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Now, when I read this story, I've had lots of people talk about this story and they're like, see, what happened in this story was because Jesus is God, he was able to see through this guy's heart and he saw that he had a greedy heart. And so all of a sudden, he's just like put this guy on the spot and he's embarrassed him and he's just calling it out. And he's like, "You're greedy, man. And everyone, you think you came here for this?" But I'm like, whoa. You do realize that is not at all what's happening here, okay? This isn't Jesus using the God and the bod thing where he knows everything. Like, yes, he has that. But Jesus is just a human in this moment. I want you to picture the scene for a second, okay? Crowds of people swarming around Jesus. And who are the types of people that came around Jesus? Marginalized people, oppressed people, sick people, injured people, people looking for a miracle. They're all there just like wanting a second, wanting to reach out. Like, "Jesus, could you pray for me? Could you heal this? Could you help me? I'm hungry." Like all these different needs. And this guy, imagine what he would have had to do to get to the front to actually have a conversation with Jesus. He would have had to push through thousands of people, marginalized, oppressed people. It's like he's just pushing them aside, pushing them to the margins. Sees sick people, leprosy. Watch your leprosy. Sorry, excuse me, coming through. Hey, Jesus, hey, can you help me with this problem I have? My brother won't give me my share of the inheritance. Everyone in the room's like, "You have an inheritance? That's amazing. How'd you get it?" Right? Like, we just want a healing. You have an inheritance. We just want food for the day. You're fighting over an inheritance? It's like everybody in this space can see his greed. It is dripping. The fact that he has got himself to the front for his own need of settling a family dispute over money. It's obvious, the greed, obvious to everyone but the man himself. "Jesus, can you solve this problem? Can you tell my brother to give me my share of the inheritance?" And Jesus, it's almost like there's this big awkward elephant in the room and Jesus is like, "Let me just address it." He's like, "Guys, watch out. Be careful of greed because it can take over your life and you don't even realize it. And that thing we just saw a moment ago where someone just came in with their own agenda, that's what greed will do to you." This is Jesus just so lovingly and gently calling out something that has the potential to destroy a life and you don't even realize it. Now, here's some of the things. It's interesting. We haven't even got to the parable yet, and already I'm like, there's some amazing things just watching the way that Jesus reacts that we learn. Two interesting things that point out. Number one, we want Jesus to fix our problems. Jesus wants to heal our hearts. So often, people came to Jesus with one issue, and Jesus is like, no. Let's talk about this. And in this story, this guy's like, "Hey, I have this problem." And Jesus is like, "I really don't care about your problem of inheritance. You have a bigger problem, and it's in your heart." So often, we come with an agenda, and Jesus has something that he wants to heal in our hearts. And he's like, "Listen, that thing that you're trying to deal with, like that's outside, that's external. I want to deal with your heart." We talked about this a few weeks ago. Jesus always goes after the heart. What's the posture? that you approach God with? When you have time with God, maybe it's a time of prayer, maybe you go for a prayer walk, maybe you open up the scriptures, maybe it's when you come to church or log into church online. Like, what's the posture? Is it, okay, I have this problem that I need solved, and so I'm looking for an answer. I'm looking in the index to try and find a verse to give me an answer to this. Or when you show up to church, like, I hope they sing my song, and I hope they preach about this. I hope they don't preach about that, because solved that years ago. And I definitely hope they speak to these people, because these people, I mean, gosh, they're so loud and so annoying on Facebook. Like, I hope the preacher just shuts that down once and for all. Like, do you show up with your problems that you want solved? Or do you show up with an open heart to say, God, I'm just ready for you to bring up whatever you want to bring up, because you know my heart and you know what I need, and often I have no idea what I need. I love what my pastor used to say. He said, sometimes the greatest act of faith in your week is showing up to a church service that you didn't plan. You didn't pick the songs, you didn't pick the scripture, you didn't pick the preacher, you didn't pick the topic, and you're just trusting that God has something for you. It's one of the reasons why, as someone who plans church services for a living, whenever I have a vacation, I always go to another church. I always go somewhere else, often a church that has longer services, because I'm like, I don't get this often. So I just go, and I'm like, I want all that God has for me. Not the things that I've planned that I think is good, where I think God's leading our church. I'm just showing up. I don't care who the preacher is. I don't care who the band is. I just want to be surprised by what God is doing. And maybe the first thing that you discover is that when you approach Jesus, unlike this man in the story, you approach humbly and curiously. Humbly, God, you know my heart, I don't. Curiously, but God, I'm really excited to find out what you're gonna do in me today. I'm really excited for what you're gonna speak to me today. Maybe that's a posture. Maybe we just need to pause right now and just say, God, whatever you wanna say to me today, I don't even know what we're talking about, but I'm trusting you have something for me. Amen. Second interesting thing I find from this quick intro to the parable is simply this. It's where Jesus goes with a legitimate legal request. This was a totally legitimate request, right? Like, to have the inheritance split two ways was not illegal. It wasn't necessarily agreed. It's just like, no, that's actually the law. It's supposed to be split both ways. My brother's being a jerk. Come on, Jesus, fix him, right? It's like, it's kind of legitimate. Jesus goes to the heart and realizes it's not, but like, the request is legitimate. And Jesus doesn't say, hey, I'm actually not in that business anymore, but if you go down to the courthouse 3 blocks south, tell them Jesus sent you, they'll give you a good rate. I know them, they're good. Doesn't say that. He's like, he just ignores the legitimate legal request and he goes to a totally different place. It's almost like Jesus is saying, you may have a legal right, but your heart is in the wrong place. You may have a legal right, but your heart is in the wrong place. You know what that says? Here's the way I'd summarize it. It is possible to be on the right side of the law and the wrong side of Jesus. It is possible to be on the right side of the law and the wrong side of Jesus. That's why it doesn't matter. Okay, let me say this carefully, but it doesn't matter your position, your title, your rank, the office that you come from, the badge that you wear, the group of people that you associate with. It doesn't matter if the lawyer's on your side, if the police are on your side, if the judge is on your side, if the pastor's on your side of whatever dispute that you're in the middle of, the divorce, the custody battle, the wrongful dismissal suit. It is possible to be on the right side of the law and on the wrong side of Jesus. You can say, yeah, but the judge ruled in my favor. I'm like, yep. But there may still have been something that you need to apologize for. Or there may still be something in there that you did wrong. Yes, you followed the law, and yes, you had the right, and yes. But Jesus' standard is higher than that. That he doesn't just ask us to follow the law of the land, but he actually says you're citizens of a different place, the kingdom of God. And as we've been learning all summer, the standard for that is way higher. And that's good as people who read the news and we see what's happening in Hong Kong and China and Belarus and south of the border and north of the border. You look at things, you're like, yeah, and they're exercising their legal rights. But it is possible to be exercising legal rights and still be on the wrong side of Jesus. And that's something to think about. Okay, let's get to the parable. That was just my intro. Whoa. So then you jump into the parable, and Jesus, because I love Jesus, he just has a story for everything. And he jumps into the story, verse 16. He says this, and he told them this parable, which is a made-up story to make a real point. Remember, it's a made-up story to make a real point. Okay, so he tells them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. So the rich man's a farmer, and he has a really good harvest, bump crop that year, okay? He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Have you ever had that problem? I haven't. Okay, you can tell. We got to translate some of this. 2,000 years old. But let's keep going. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And then, once he has his bigger barns and his surplus, he says, I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. Okay? And then Jesus keeps going on with his made-up story. So in the made-up story, God shows up. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life is demanded of you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? He's like, tonight you die. Tonight your life is over. You never know what's gonna come. It's like, tonight's the night. What's gonna happen with all these storehouses that you built? And then this is Jesus' conclusion. This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God. This is how it will be for those who store up things for themselves, but are not rich towards God. That when you read this story, here's a fun little project after. Count how many times I and my comes up. My fruit, my barns, my goods, my soul. As Andy Stanley would say, this man suffers from a consumption assumption. What's that? Here it's on the screen. It's greed is the assumption that it is all for my consumption. Greed is the assumption that it is all for my consumption. Now, before we get too hard on this guy, let's just pause and reflect in our own life. Remember, speck of sawdust, log in our own eye. Remember that whole thing Jesus says? So we always want to look internally instead of pointing the finger and saying, they're so messed up. That's so easy, especially in the age of social media. Let's even the playing field. Let's just do a little self-inventory. How often have I, when we find out that we're getting a raise or a bonus, or you're a high school student who happened to work 1 hour enough to qualify for the CERB and you went to being a $2,000 a month an heir, how many of you in that moment, the first thing you thought of was your barns? How many of you, when you found out you were coming into money, it was a birthday gift, it was a raise, it was a bonus, it was the CERB that you weren't expecting, you didn't have any bills, you were still living in your parents' basement. How many of you thought of your own barns? And how many of you thought, oh my gosh, I can't wait to give this away. I can think of so many people in need. Let's be honest. Many of us, including myself, immediately think of themselves and how we can add to our bigger barns. It's easy to point at this story and be like, so selfish. People starving and he builds a bigger barn. But the reality is if we're gut level honest, we're similar. Many, including me, suffer this greed assumption. Greed is the assumption that it's all for my consumption. And here's the crazy thing. Our hearts drift there and we're not even aware of it. Can I tell you a little preacher tip, preacher secret, peek behind the curtain, a little bit about my world that I never tell anyone, but I'll tell you right now. Preachers never tell anyone when they're preaching on greed. We tell people when we're talking about sex, we put it on social media, we're talking about sex, like atheists show up, they're like, maybe you have a secret we didn't think about, right? It's just like, everybody knows we have issues with sex, so we'll come to a sermon on sex. Everybody knows they have problems in marriage, and if they don't, the person sleeping next to them will tell them they have problems in marriage, so they'll show up to a sermon on marriage. We advertise that. If I ever tell people we're preaching on greed, nobody shows up. Why? Because nobody thinks they have a problem with greed. Let me prove the point more. I have heard crazy things in my office. I'm just being honest, okay? Pastors, we hear stuff sometimes like, we're like, wow, okay, yeah. Then we go home and Google it. We're like, I'm not sure what they just confessed to me, right? Like, I'm telling you, we hear stuff like, it's wild. Nobody, I'm not even kidding, not one person has ever said, Pastor, can we meet? We sit down, I have a problem with greed. Never. It's a problem we see all throughout our world and nobody realizes that it is this thing. And this is why Jesus says, I'm warning you, be careful and guard against all kinds of greed. Because it's the thing that we see all around. It's the thing we see on the news. It's the thing we critique in others, but we have such a hard time seeing in our own hearts. And so today we're pausing with Jesus' words to look at our own hearts. Forget about the rest of the world for today. Let's just look at our own hearts. It's so important. So let's get back to the story. There's a man in the story who worked for it, earned it, it's his, and Jesus calls him, let's not mince words, Jesus calls him a greedy fool. That clashes with our idea of wealth management. This guy came by his wealth honestly. He's not a mob boss. He's not participating in tax evasion. He's not running a pyramid scheme. He's not changing the wills of the elderly while they, look on unsuspectingly and sign their life away to them. He's not involved in any illegal activity, and Jesus calls him a greedy fool. How does that make any sense at all? He's clashing with our view of money management because if anything, we would call him in our culture wise. He's investing wisely. And 2,000 years ago, he was wise. And not only was he wise 2,000 years ago, but in that culture, when you were rich, you were known to be blessed by God, or that's what people thought. So not only was he wise, he's blessed. So people hear Jesus tell a story of a made-up rich man, and Jesus calls what everyone in the room would think is wise and blessed, and he calls him a greedy fool. Jesus is clashing with our understanding and their understanding of wealth. I want to just give you 5 things that Jesus is clashing up against, 5 lies that we believe often that actually holds us back from living the Jesus way, living the kingdom way, and actually having the potential to transform our world. So here's 5 lies that we believe that this story is challenging about money. And if you're not a church person, not a Christian, these are great things to kind of like peek in and think about and wrestle through as you're wrestling through what it looks like to follow Jesus, because it's fascinating. So the first one is, here's the first lie: I'm not rich. I'm not rich. Some of you are like, no, clearly, Mark, you need to come to my house. You'll know I'm not rich. But you need to understand who Jesus is talking to in this story. He's talking to a whole bunch of day laborers who literally work hand to mouth, that if they don't work that day, their kids don't eat that day. And then he tells a story of someone who has extra. So if you have more than just daily provision, it's the reason why Jesus teaches people just pray for daily bread, not weekly, monthly, yearly, or retirement bread. Jesus just says daily bread, because that culture, you didn't know if your kids were eating that night. So Jesus, in that sense, is saying, you're rich if you don't have to worry about your next meal. So when we look back at ourselves, if we're not living hand to mouth, if you own a storage locker, if you upgrade your technology and your cars and things in your house before they need replacing, like they're not broken, you just upgrade them. If you, ready for this one? If you keep change in your ashtray, think about this. You keep cash, I keep cash in a garbage receptacle, you're rich, according to Jesus. It's like, well, but what about them? They're like, they're rich. No, Jesus is like, no. If you're not in this category, then you're rich. If you have any excess whatsoever besides food, clothing, and shelter, that's rich in Jesus' eyes, and he has some things that he wants to teach us about how we use our money. We dare not ignore this story because we think it doesn't apply, because most of us it does, that we are rich. We don't feel rich because rich is a moving target, but we are. Second lie we believe, well, I earned it, so it's mine. I earned it, it's mine. You know what the amazing thing about the story, in this story, is this farmer believes it's all his own doing. Any farmer knows they can work hard, and if it doesn't rain, they're nothing. But this farmer has been blinded by his success, and he thinks it's all his. He forgot that his big crop was reliant on God giving him rain. There are so many variables in our lives: weather, the land, the family that we're born into. This idea of a self-made man, and yes, I realize and we agree with working hard, but there's realities all across the world, and if you're gut level honest, even in your own neighborhoods, I grew up in neighborhoods and I look and I'm like, yeah, the reality is, I love that song from Nas, I know I can be what I wanna be if I work hard at it. Remember that? Maybe you don't. Anyways, different genre. But I used to think about that song and I'm like, yeah, it's true, but it doesn't take into account the realities. And I love that that's what it's encouraging, is to work hard and to get out of some really hard situations. But there's realities that limit us. And this man was blinded by his success. And he's like, no, everything I have is because of me and it's for my consumption. And he forgot about God. As Jesus followers, we don't see ourselves as the owners. We see ourselves as stewards. That we have this humility to understand everything I have is the grace of God. That even the hard work that I have is the ability that I had, is the mind that I was given. Yes, I had to work hard. Yes, I had to study hard, but we acknowledge that God played a massive part. And so as Jesus people, we don't see ourselves as owners, but as stewards. And we see everything that we have, every blessing that we have is meant to be used as a blessing to others. You read that theme all throughout Scripture, that we are blessed to be a blessing, not for ourselves as the man in the story was. It is always for others. So here's a question. Do you invite God to speak into your financial decisions? That clashes with our individualistic society. Here's a fun test, and I'm just gonna be honest. If you feel kind of like this is rough, like I struggled with this test too, but here's a fun test. Think about the things we've talked about this summer in Clash of Kings series. Think about all the things that Jesus is for. This is just a skimming of some of the things in the kingdom. Voice to the voiceless, taking care of orphans and widows, anti-racist movements, taking care of oppressed, marginalized, and impoverished people, trafficked people, people who have been abused by religious power mongers. When you just think of some of those examples and some of the things we've covered, how much of your wealth, and by wealth I mean your time, your energy, your skill set, and your money, has gone to those kingdom things? Every day, we have a choice to leverage our wealth for ourselves, as the man in this story did, or to be rich towards God. And to be rich towards God is to love God and love people. Every day we get a choice. Jesus followers, we believe we're not owners, we're stewards. Everything we've been given is a gift from God entrusted to us to care for the world around us and the people around us. Lie number 3, it's just money. You know what's really interesting? Jesus talked a lot about money. You will not, I promise you will not find one example of Jesus asking anyone for money. There's one time he was telling a story and he's like, does anyone have a coin? And then he gives it back after. It was an example, so that one doesn't count, okay? You will not find Jesus ever asking people for money, but he talked about money all the time. I like what one author said. Jesus wasn't after your money. He was just making sure your money didn't get you, because it's not just money. The lie we believe is it's just money. The truth is that it's like a God, that it has the ability to take over your life, to grip your heart, to take control and reorientate everything. And if you think I'm sounding dramatic, let me tell you a story that'll help. A while ago, my wife and I were looking for a house, and we kind of had 2 budgets. So we had a budget for a house if it was just gonna be our family living there, and then it was like, if it's a bigger house and it has room for me to renovate and add another unit and rent it out, then we could afford a bigger, if you understand, yeah, okay, good. So we had 2 budget areas, right? And so anyways, we ended up going to this one house that we're like, I think that one has potential for it to be a rental unit, so that fits into this budget category. And we got there and realized pretty quickly, no, there's actually no way to make a rental unit here, so this is totally out of our price range, but we're already here. So why would we turn down the opportunity to look in people's cabinets and open their drawers and do all the things that you do at open houses? That's what you do at open houses, right? No? Okay, anyways, so we're already in the house, and I don't know about you, but if you've ever been looking for a rental unit or a house, you have your kryptonite, right? You have your thing, it's like, it's totally impractical, there's no parking, but babe, there's a hot tub, we have to live here, right? It's like, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's like his and her toilets. I don't know what it is that's your thing, but like everybody has a kryptonite that you walk in and you're like, this is our future home. So anyways, can I just tell you, mine's not hot tubs, it's not, I don't know, all those things, but it's the pantry. Okay, I love organizing, and in our house right now, we have this cabinet that's like long and narrow and deep, and it's where good intentions go to die. It's like your vegetable drawer, okay? Good intentions just go to die there, okay? So anyways, we have this pantry, and I can never keep it organized, and then the kids come, they take out snacks, I'm like, it's terrible. So anyways, I walk into this kitchen, and I'm like, there's no pantry. There's no pantry cabinet. And I'm like, what's this door to Neverland? Like, what is, open a door in the middle of the kitchen, I'm not even kidding you, okay? And it's a room, like legit room, like where there's a light switch because there's a light in there. Like this room needs to be lit. It's huge. And I walk in there, you can fit my whole family in there, right? And there's shelves. It's a pantry room. There's shelves and more shelves and more shelves. And I'm like, babe, I grab her hand, I'm like, babe. We could label it, we could put bins and boxes and see-through boxes, and we could see everything. I'm like, we could put a counter in here, we could have our toaster, we could not have our toaster on the counter like all those low-class people. We could put our toaster in the pantry room, right? And I'm like measuring, I'm like, we could fit a butler bed here, right? Like we could, eventually we just left and we're like, we can't afford that house. A week later, I'm not even kidding you, this is a true story. I show up to my wife and I'm like, babe, it's still for sale. And I did some math. And if you go back to work full time, I know our daughter's young, so I'm not sure what to do with her yet. I'm still figuring that out. But like, forget about Kaya for a minute. Forget about our daughter for a minute. I said this to my wife. I'm not even kidding, right? Forget about Kaya for a minute, right? I'm like, if you go back to work full time, and I'll sell my car, so I'll just bike to work. It's not that far. I can bike. Winter, we'll figure it out. But I'll bike. It's all good. So like, we'll do that. And then in the evenings when I don't have meetings, like I'll have a side hustle. I'll do construction. So I'll make some more money there. And then we're pretty close to being able to afford this house. What the heck? What am I doing? Do you know what happened? I walked in and greed gripped my heart. That all of a sudden, I wasn't thinking about how do we raise some more money to send over to orphans in this place and take care and what's happening downtown Hope House. All of a sudden, it's like I'm leveraging everything I have because I've tasted something and I want it. And now I've reorientated my entire life. I don't even know what's happening with my daughter. I don't even know where she is right now because I want something. It's gripped my heart and I don't even realize it. I asked my wife, I'm like, hey babe, can I share that story? She's like, yo, that is so true because I don't even understand what happened to you. You're the guy who's constantly wanting to renovate a school bus and live in there as a family. But something came over you. Greed took over. That's what happens. You walk into the store and all of a sudden it's like, I didn't even know they carried that. It's on sale, what's happening? Well, what if we in monthly payment, and how about, and what about, and all of a sudden our heart is reorientated away from the things that we know life is all about, loving God and loving people. And it consumes us and it takes over the trajectory of our life. And just like the man in the story, we're oblivious to it and everyone else around us can see it. Friends, it's not just money. It has the ability to take over our lives. Number 4. Fourth lie we believe, I'm in control. Money has a way of building a false sense of security. This one's easy. If COVID taught us anything, it's that our plans are pretty flimsy. I remember when quarantine started, I was like, babe, let's go get my desk. We might be home for a whole 2 weeks. That'd be really hard to do without a desk. 2 weeks, imagine? Imagine now we know differently. Isn't it amazing how money creates a false sense of security? If anything, we learn that I'm not in control. I love James, one of the New Testament epistles. He just writes this out and he's like, hey, listen, you who have all these plans. He's like, you don't even know what's gonna happen tomorrow. Nobody saw COVID coming. You don't know what's gonna happen next year. Then he has this amazingly encouraging line. He's like, you're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. He's like, that's your life, which is so not encouraging. And yet such a good reality check. He's like, and then he has this amazing line. If you need to hear this today, you just need to go and highlight this, underline it, circle it, and just declare it. He's like, instead you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Should you have long-term plans and retirement savings? Sure. You have all the plans you want. But every day you're like, Lord willing. You're just aware that money doesn't buy you security and you have no idea what the future holds. You can choose to live selfishly or you can choose to live generously as Jesus calls us to. Number 5, fifth lie we believe, I can retire. Whoa, wait, Mark, hang on. Don't worry, just stay with me for 1 second before you leave. This is the only passage in scripture that I'm aware of that speaks of retirement, and let's just be honest, I don't think Jesus is talking about the thing that we call retirement. Okay. This is a man who built his entire wealth so that he could check out and live a self-centered life. And Jesus is saying to that, you cannot do that. This is not a passage about whether you can and cannot retire and should it be 50 or 55 or 60 or 65 or 70. Like, you won't find that in this story. You will find a warning to never think that you can check out of your God-given mandate to live in the kingdom and to love God and love people. This idea of I can do what I want because I've done my time, I like this line better. If I'm not dead, God's not done. If I'm not dead, God's not done. I told you, this applies to all ages. You're 20, you're 40, you're 60, you're 80. If you're not dead, God's not done. You're still a citizen in the kingdom. You are still called to love God and to love people. And to do that in incredible and creative ways. You may spend your hours differently. You may not go to an office anymore. You may live in a different space, but you do not retire from the kingdom of heaven. And that's good news because that means you get to continue to live the way you were designed, which is loving God, loving people in all the creative ways that you can think of. So this is what it means. If you're still living, you're still breathing, you get to creatively and aggressively love God and love people with everything in you. Like my friend at the gym, who's technically retired from his job, but is working and having a great time volunteering with international students, teaching them language and telling them about Jesus. It's like the retired airline pilot who's part of our church who started a nonprofit. It's called Scrap Goat, and every week he's volunteering dozens and dozens of hours, and he's made connections all across the city and makes tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of dollars every year, never taking a dollar of it, but going to charity. And anytime you run into him, he'll always stop and have a conversation with you because he loves God and he loves people, and he's doing it creatively and aggressively. It's like the 74-year-old businessman who sold his business, who was a lakesider, and 2 weeks later took a job as our head of maintenance in this facility. And every day you run into him, Larry, how's it going? Best day ever. Absolutely fantastic. Loves it. Loves that he gets to creatively take care of this space and take care of the people in this space and serve them. Why? He's creatively and aggressively loving God and loving people. I think of the elderly couples this week, some of which haven't even stepped foot in the building yet, still figuring out safety and all that, and we totally respect that, and yet showed up in their cars, picking up packages and delivering them to doors of families that weren't able to make it here to take care of them, creatively and aggressively loving God and loving others. Think of our friend Anne. She's probably watching this morning from home, often unable to leave her home because of age and all the different challenges that she's faced. And up until recently, while battling all that, also doing palliative care for her own mother at home. And yet every morning, I've told you this before, sends a text to my wife with prayers for our kids. Creatively and aggressively. She's not dead. God's not done. She still has a purpose in this life. That is a life rich towards God. That is a life the way God designed it. And that's what we're called to as Jesus people. That's our destiny, that we never have to stop living as God created us, creatively and aggressively loving God and loving people. That's what Jesus did. He gave his entire life on the cross to bring us in relationship to God. Gave it all for us. So here's what I want to do for the next few moments. I want to just invite us to be still, to be quiet, because we believe the Spirit of God is constantly wanting to speak to us, sometimes in an audible voice, but often just in a thought or a word picture or bringing something to mind or someone to mind. And so here's the question I want to leave us with to reflect for the next 2 minutes. How can I be rich towards God? How can I be rich towards God? Let's just be still. Invite Spirit to speak to us. Well, before you head out, I want to just remind you of coffee outside if you'd like to grab some on your way out. Socially distanced, you know how to do it. This is normal now, but feel free to hang out there as much as you'd like. Prayer team member, I think Robin Elliott's going to be up here at the front, ready to pray with you for anything. And if you're here today, you want to, actually talk about starting a relationship with Jesus, she'd be happy to chat with you and pray with you too. So feel free to make use of that. And before you go, can I just invite you to stand? I just love to do this as a community and just to bless you. And here's all it is. You're not dead. God's not done. Go in Jesus' name, friends. Love you.